IVM.
What has Al-Qaeda been up to since the death of Osama Bin Laden? What happens in India and the subcontinent after the Islamic State falls? What does the Bollywood director Vishal Bharadwaj have to do with any of this? All of this and more on today's episode of the Pragati Podcast. Hi, you're listening to the Pragati Podcast and I'm your host Hamsini Hariharan. Every week, my co-host Pavan, Srinath and I get together to discuss economics, policy and international affairs. This week on the show, we discuss one of the most feared non-state actors in the world, the Al-Qaeda. My guest for today is Adrian Levy, who recently wrote the book The Exile, the stunning inside story of Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in flight, along with Kathy Scott Clark. Adrian's an investigative journalist who has been writing about terrorism for nearly the last 20 years. The book is fantastic because it has interviews with presidents, diplomats, members of the Secret Service in Pakistan and the US, and even several of Bin Laden's wives. I caught up with Adrian a few weeks ago along the sidelines of the Bangalore Lit Fest and managed to ask him a few questions not only about the book, but also terrorism in general. What was fascinating as soon as he started was the process by which he and his co-author managed to gather information.
Well, the first thing is that I work with another person called Kathy Scott Clark, who's the co-writer in all these books. And in this case, it's just important for people to know who are listening in that if you follow up any of this, that she was empowered to do the best parts of this book. And she did it because she took advantage of the way in which conservative Islam perceived women. And she did it with a niqab. And she worked very quietly across the Middle East and was greeted and made contacts that enabled a lot of this material to come together. So you have to know it's a jigsaw puzzle that we're piecing together. And it's not my work. I'm not just speaking on behalf of myself.
The global war on terror started in 2001 and ended in 2013. It's been more than 16 years since the war on terror began and about 4 years since the former American president, Barack Obama, announced its end. The Al-Qaeda was the primary target of this campaign. How did it even manage to survive in such an environment?
If you look at the forces ranged against it, by all means it should have been destroyed. It should have been obliterated. Yeah. So one asks, how did it survive? How did Al-Qaeda survive? And the reason it survived was twofold. One, it negotiated sanctuary for itself very successfully with Iran. And it was a counterintuitive move. Obviously, Iran is a nascent Shia superpower, and we have Al-Qaeda, which is a proscribed Sunni organisation. And the question that everyone raises is they're not easy bedfellows, so how could that happen? But what people forget is that Iran and the deep state are eminently pragmatic. And that deep state, a laminated state, part of that lamination, or at least one tier, is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards Council, and within that Quds Force. And the Quds Force, the covert wing for foreign policy, is eminently pragmatic, and its basic belief is your enemy's enemy is your friend, and therefore the idea of manipulating a force like Al-Qaeda or using it as a bargaining chip is right up the street of Iran. And the other thing to remember is that Iran, of course, is not a democratic or let's say a parliamentary democracy, and therefore it's not thinking in 5 years or 3 year terms, unlike the American presidentials, where they basically get 3 years to govern and then 2 years to argue about who governed next. They are a theocratic nation which is thinking in theocratic terms, so the deep state's timeline is drastically different, and therefore a strategic view with Iran can mean 10, 12, 15 years. So take that, the lamination of the state, the pragmatic functioning of Quds Force, and the theocratic timeline, and what you have is a perfect storm.
Gaining sanctuary in Iran was an ingenious move on part of the Al-Qaeda, and Iran realized that giving the group refuge could be an asset and perhaps a bargaining chip in the future. But as Iran was declared as part of the Axis of Evil in 2003, most of Bin Laden's family managed to move there. What is striking in this is the way the Al-Qaeda worked out of several countries. This made it unique as a violent non-state actor that didn't follow a hub-and-spokes model with a single center of command and control. Rather, it was a fluid organization with many different heads.
It had many different iterations. It had a hub and nodes. It then went for franchises. And then it went for franchises and fellow travellers. It also has, of course, as you know, its intent from the beginning was to facilitate more than anything. So, originally there were only around 400 members of Al-Qaeda who swore a bay'at, an oath to Osama Bin Laden. And when it reformed inside Iran and it reformed its financial pipeline, it became another thing again. And its idea in Iran, its first attack was in 2003 when the Riyadh compounds were attacked. Its idea then was to try and find a new place for itself, a new voice, because it's very cacophonous. And things went radically wrong for them straight away. Zarqawi split from the organisation, could not be controlled. And he began his own sectarian war in Iraq, slaughtering other sects, Ahmadis and Shias in particular. And that bloodshed alienated a huge amount of the Ummah, the wider community. So Al-Qaeda looked at that and first of all wished him dead. And a lot of the letters show they tried to tether him, he wouldn't be tethered. And they went from mildly respecting him to despising him. And eventually he died in 2006. And what Al-Qaeda does is it reforms. It writes a series of policy papers against violence, against barbarianism, against sectarianism. And they're looking at the IRGC model and the Hezbollah model. And their idea is that you will have a military vanguard and you will have a welfare wing and you'll be an organisation that's more palpable. And also what they decided to do was to lower their brand. So rather than entering with the black banners and rather than being at the front, they became the vanguard going from the back. They stopped sloganeering, they removed the flag, and they changed the ethos of the organisation so it became an enabler again, in the pure sense, but a military enabler. And this period takes us through, basically, Al-Qaeda's conflict with Islamic State, as Islamic State rose.
Abu Musaf al-Zarqawi, who Adrian briefly mentioned, was a Jordanian terrorist who declared himself the emir of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was killed in 2006 in a US airstrike, and his death is striking because here lay the roots of a terrorist group that we now call the Islamic State, or ISIS, or Daesh. With the rise of this new group, Al-Qaeda's reach in the region seemed to be waning. I asked Adrian what he thought of this.
So a view in America, you'll read it all over, is that Al-Qaeda was decapitated, that they were sent in flight, that they lost their constituency, that they were trumped by Islamic State that captured the popular vote, the X and Y generations that you had. This is not true. It's totally not true. Al-Qaeda reformed, it rethought its structures, it became newly rich, it set up its new pipeline under a guy called Yassin al-Suri. Money comes from Qatar and the Gulf and Saudi, and then it pours into Pakistan, and it pours into Iraq. And what they did then was attach themselves to the national liberation struggle against Assad in Syria, and they had foot soldiers waiting for them. 400 members of Al-Qaeda in 9/11, maybe 40,000 now. Wow. The pipeline is successful. Their franchises are running in the Levant, they're running in North Africa, they're running very successfully, although they've not been hyperactive, in Southeast Asia, and they're running successfully in South Asia, where they've melded and divided the jihad factory in Pakistan.
All of this forms part of the American narrative of winning against terrorism and terrorists as a whole. But Adrian went on to point that the narrative of the Al-Qaeda sort of winding down began much before the actual on-ground operations began.
None of this is prefaced by anti-Americanism. This is an attempt to understand different schools of thought. And the American thought has been very much to downplay the importance of Al-Qaeda in certain schools. And that's because it's a narrative that's been delivered from the Obama administration. Their success in running Osama down to Abbottabad in May 2011 was then projected as the ruination of the entire organisation of Al-Qaeda. And so what follows is the tactical and strategic leaking of photographs that portray him as a wizened old man, staring anxiously up at a TV screen, and rumours that came out of the Pentagon that he was downloading porn, he was a degenerate, and then they cherry-pick documents. We get to see 12 or 14, and those documents would suggest out of the trawl of 1 million plus that the organisation is on its uppers and basically is corrupt, venal, and collapsing.
This is the state of affairs in 2011. What happens after America starts crafting its narrative? Think of the most famous movie in 2012 that topped every critic's list.
It's really the intel. That's it.
Quite frankly, I didn't even want to use you guys. with your dip and your Velcro and all your gear bullshit. I wanted to drop a bomb. But people didn't believe in this lead enough to drop a bomb. So they're using you guys as canaries in the theory that if Bin Laden isn't there, you can sneak away and no one will be the wiser. But Bin Laden is there. And you're gonna kill him for me.
You just listened to a snippet from the greatest manhunt in the world, or as the movie was otherwise called, 0-30. I'm here with Adrian Levy, who wrote a book called The Exile, along with Kathy Scott Clark. Adrian was going to explain to me how 0-30, which was a critic's favorite, was part of the larger American narrative against the Al-Qaeda.
The Obama administration went into the movie business. And, the CIA and the White House sat down with the filmmakers. And they created that narrative. And the narrative was the end of Al-Qaeda, one, which, let them get away with that. But much more pernicious than that, the narrative was that torture works, inherently wrong, provably, demonstrably wrong. Not just the Feinstein report, the Senate report on torture, which is full of errors. There are other things we can look at. Information that was given that was powerful and that moved the West on to understand Al-Qaeda was given voluntary as part of a criminal justice system where interrogations were thorough and within the rule of law. Torture was immoral, ineffective, illegal, and it lost America the high moral ground. Enhanced interrogation was a disaster for America. And yet 0-30 was part of the narrative justifying that as far as I can see. Al-Qaeda, in fact, in my view, then began its process, it's the last tier of its process of evolution. And, all it needed really then was a shopfront. And the shopfront it chose was Hamza Bin Laden.
Hamza Bin Laden is the son of Osama Bin Laden, who, as recently as September 2017, called for continuing the Syrian jihad, and he'd earlier placed the lone wolf attacks.
So from 2015, up pops Hamza. No one's heard of him for 15 years, and there's a reason for that, and that's because he's been in Iran, and he was only released with his mum, Kyria, from Iran in 2010. But also, a lot of articles you'll read right now will say that Hamza is, there was a great one in the Daily Beast I read recently that said, and in Time, that said Hamza will unite all jihad. He's like the devil's spawn, And, this is a boy who has never fired a gun, who was never trained to be a soldier, who has no strategic skills whatsoever, was not an heir, Osama had no heir, was not treated as an heir, and spent all of his life effectively imprisoned in a Quds Force base in northern Tehran. And Osama's last wishes, told to his wife in 2011, were for those kids and the wives to have a civilian existence. And Hamza was to be a cleric, effectively, or lead a clerical life, and study in Qatar and learn, more scholarly things in Qatar. So this new projection that's coming out of the West, that what you have is an uber villain, is just the creation of a new demonization.
I guess anxieties of parents around the world do not change, whether you're a middle-class Indian or the leader of the Al-Qaeda. But what was interesting is this new narrative which propped up Hamza Bin Laden. Was it a result of Obama's plan not to pull out of Afghanistan? While the American president had earlier announced a deadline by which American troops would leave the country, the stance was one that the superpower was finding hard to stick to.
Yeah. I mean, there's many things you can argue. Obama wanted mainly a second administration fillip. They wanted to get that vote bounce. You do that by having complete policies, not partial. It's not as attractive to say we nearly succeeded and we got him, but the organisation's thriving. That's a hard electoral message. They were being politicians. Let's not blame him too much because by comparison to the present administration, he is a saintly god. So in terms of, what they did wrong, there are plenty of things they did wrong in foreign policy. But let's just nail it. We can nail it that they tried to skew the narrative and they try to portray it in a way that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us understand how those forces will evolve and where they may spring from next.
All of this ties down to what is happening to the Al-Qaeda presently. I became curious as to what was happening to the group in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Does anyone know? I mean, Al-Qaeda are not there. So the first thing to bear in mind is that Al-Qaeda are not there. The drone war made them decide to leave. They wrote about it. All the interviews we did showed that they decided to do that. I mean, it's true that Hamza is commuting up and down in that region. And it's true that Ayman al-Zawahiri is also commuting up and down in that region. But, they are not Al-Qaeda. The military base for Al-Qaeda is Saif al-Adil, the Egyptian Special Forces soldier, who's been active since the death of Sadat. And Saif al-Adil is living in Quds Force House, Safe House, in District 9 in Tehran. And the reason he's living there is because drone strikes don't go in Tehran, and nor do IS and other kinds of faction suicide squads.
That's Saeed al-Adal, an Egyptian who worked closely with Osama Bin Laden and was in the higher echelons of the Al-Qaeda, where he possibly even served as interim leader for a while.
So, if you think about it, the strategy is clever. They've got the top 3 military leaders beneath Saif al-Adil who are attached to the struggle at the moment in Syria. Those leaders were flown over by Iran in 2015 and facilitated incredible times, these partnerships, because at that point Iran wanted to face down Islamic State. You've got then the financial pipeline still controlled by the same person at al-Siri, and that pipeline is still running from the Gulf into Iran and out again. And you've got a floating political leadership, which is harder to pin down, and then all of the other fronts for Al-Qaeda. So what is the worst possible scenario that could come out of that? It isn't the Pakistan scenario, because Pakistan doesn't play into this. It's the scenario whereby IS, having been beaten territorially with Mosul and Raqqa falling, elements of it merge, not the leaderships, elements of it merge with Al-Qaeda. That's tremendously worrying. They've self-radicalised a lot of diaspora communities and converts all over Europe and North America. They've also radicalised in India. There are cells all over India. All over is an exaggeration, but certainly UP, Bangalore, and other places, Rajasthan, Mumbai, Delhi, have IS cells who are directly in communication with IS when it existed.
In early December, Iraq declared victory over the Islamic State, and Russia announced that it was pulling its troops out of Syria. But what we don't know is what this means for terrorism in the future. In India, as recently as 12th December 2017, the PTI, or the Press Trust of India, reported that a Delhi court had arrested a man under the Prevention of Unlawful Activities Act, as he was allegedly recruiting youths to fight for the Al-Qaeda. As India is a country that's faced terrorist attacks through its history, it is but natural that our national security take a front seat. Which brings me to, how does the fall of ISIS affect our more susceptible neighbours, Pakistan and Afghanistan?
What's left in Pakistan? It's not Al-Qaeda. There is new Islamic State, which is sort of captured small amounts of terrain. They're meant to be in Tora Bora at the moment. But really they're not a threat. They're also not organic. They'll find it tremendously difficult to be a match for Taliban, which is, largely speaking, an enormous movement with its roots in the country, in Kandahar. And what we have then is the Haqqani network, which is a tool of foreign policy, and so largely speaking untouchable. And we have the domestic jihad fronts in Pakistan. Who are they now, and are they effective? Well, I mean, the debate right now, coming out of Pakistan, is this very interesting notion, the military saying, shall we make them political parties? And read the reactions to that in the newspapers. Pakistanis are terrified by that prospect. Read the editorials in Dawn and the News.
The mainstreaming of militants in Pakistan is something that other experts have also mentioned. If you go to thinkpragati.com, you'll be able to find pieces on the recent Bareilly protests by Rohan Joshi and TCA Raghavan. Their points, as is Adrian's, is similar. The mainstreaming of militants would set a dangerous precedent in the politics of any country, let alone Pakistan.
It will also do two other things. One, it's deliberately a decoy aimed at Modi. It's a way of saying we are Islamizing democracy and preventing there being any rapprochement between Modi and Pakistan. And it's in the interest of the hardline forces to encourage disagreement and the likelihood of talks. And that's what Pakistanis suspect is one of the prime motives in the intelligence establishment. The second motive is to discredit democracy. Of course, military business is worth billions of dollars, and the military wants to keep hold of that business. And democracy, as we've seen, is something that is fragile in Pakistan. with Nawaz Sharif being ousted and his wife taking over his seat. So there are still many different factions to play. And also, one other thing, as a regular visitor, as someone who loves Pakistan, it's really important to say that Pakistanis have suffered as a result of these policies horrendously. And no one mentions it. They think this is an incidental. 60,000 plus. Who knows the real figures? You know, you think about the attack on the university that happened in 2016. I can still remember the photographs really clearly. Think about the Lahore suicide bombing that happened in 2016. The victims in each case, 76 here, 100 here, hundreds injured, no medical care, no aftercare. It's a horrendous situation. They are living in terror, and they are dealing with it, and they're dealing with it hand to mouth. And it's important to remember that they are as much as victims of what Zia put in place in 1979 with the creation of that radical state as anyone else.
As recently as 30th November 2017, 9 students were killed in a terrorist attack at an agriculture college in Peshawar, and many more were injured. Many attribute the roots of this violence back to the 1970s, when Zia-ul-Haq promoted a political identity centered around Islam.
So I'm not a pundit. I'm someone who researches, and I go into situations to try and tell stories from the other way around. But I can make some observations, maybe based on interviews and talking to people. Al-Qaeda at the moment is deciding what it wants to be, and we know that because Kathy and has been in Jordan, and we've been in Jordan and Mauritania and in loads of other countries talking to the clerics who are responsible for those policies. And there's a series of drafts of letters being drawn up right now by Zawahiri, and those letters are to discuss what Al-Qaeda sees as a way forward, how to bind itself. And so that discussion is still very much in the Toyota Hilux phase. It's hot in the combat zone, and it's not really being decided upon. But what we have noticed, really broadly, is that in India, criminalisation and criminal cells became Islamist cells. That transformation began to happen when Dawood left the country, Dawood Ibrahim left the country, after the 92, 93 attacks in Mumbai. That process of Islamisation did happen. And then, when Al-Qaeda came along, Al-Qaeda divided a lot of the domestic jihad movements. So the ones that were strictly anti-Indian often became anti-Indian and pro-Al-Qaeda. So LET is a great example. They split, James. And LET half went with Ilyas Kashmiri, not half, let's not use percentages, a section. And a section stayed with Hafiz Saeed. And the same thing will happen. There'll be a mitosis where people move to new brands, they move to new fronts. So what does that mean? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that although the story of IS and Al-Qaeda in India has not yet been told properly, and they've been quite successful in forming cells, but it's poorly written about and researched, what will be interesting is whether they can find nourishment here and whether they really can bed down or they maintain a low-level criminal presence. I believe they're going to find it tremendously hard to survive in India because they need feed matter to survive. They need a diaspora community that will support them, and I don't believe they're going to find that here. I don't believe they'll find it in UP, and I don't believe they'll find it in Bangalore and in other places. Although, having said that, we're living in times which are hugely charged with a very jingoistic government, and we've seen, as your listeners know all too well, but I remind myself reading the newspaper, regular stories about lynchings and riots, which people find horrifying and shocking. And that sectarianism that's creeping in does feed into the terror module as well. One has to consider it.
The nexus between state and non-state actors in Pakistan is deep and long-running. But it got me wondering, where do we go from here? What's the future of terrorist groups in the Indian subcontinent?
Let's hope democracy works in Pakistan. And, I heard messages in this festival still with people saying you can only deal with the military. They're the cohesive force. That's structurally true, but practically false. And it's not a paradigm we should enter into. The Americans have believed that for years, and they've armed and, pandered to the military in Pakistan, and it's not helped. It's undermined the development of the country. And, I don't believe that paradigm. I don't believe it.
There are also other factors that inhibit the rise of such terrorist groups in India. Perhaps one reason is that the wheels of our intelligence and other national security is working. And the second reason, perhaps, is to remember that India does have a strong rule of law that was not present in any of the countries in which Al-Qaeda has been successful. But what Adrian says is important. We shouldn't allow for sectarianism to creep into our national fabric. A look at Pakistan will tell us what happens when a democracy deteriorates into a religious state. That's it for this episode of the Pragati Podcast. You should check out the book, The Exile, in which Adrian and his co-author, Kathy Scott Clark, do comprehensive interviews with Osama Bin Laden's wives and children, Secret Service of several countries, diplomats, bureaucrats, and so on. Here's a fun tidbit. Vishal Bharadwaj apparently wants to adapt a dramatized version of the book into a film. We do not know how that'll turn out, but if you want to read more about the mainstreaming of militants in Pakistan, do check out some of the reading on the episode page at thinkpragati.com. You can also listen to episode 18 of the Pragati Podcast, where I sit down with TCA Raghavan, the former ambassador to Pakistan, as he weighs in on what's happening in the country. If you have any questions or comments or brickbats, write into podcast@thinkpragati.com and we'll answer them in later episodes. We're also on Twitter as @ZeusIsDead and as @HamsiniH. You can listen to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And of course, on thinkpragati.com. We'll be back next week.
एक्सक्यूज मी भैया, एक्सक्यूज मी।
बोलिए मैडम।
मेन्यू में क्या है?
मेन्यू में सीन अनसीन है, पॉडकास्ट है, ऑन कोर्स है, साइरस है, मेड इन इंडिया, रीडिस्कवरी प्रोजेक्ट, एम्पावरिंग सीरीज, सेक्स वैक्स है, IVM लाइक्स है, सिंप्लीफाइड है, कीपिंग इट क्वियर है, थिंग्स एंड डेस्टिनेशंस है, माय नेबर सकरबर्ग है और द फैन गराज है। आपको क्या चाहिए?
एक बार रिपीट कर देंगे क्या?
रिपीट नहीं करता हम। आप जाओ IVMpodcast.com पे और सुनो ये सब, या फिर डाउनलोड करो उनका ऐप, सब आपकी उंगलियों पे।